Hey everyone, welcome back to Haven Within Stronger Minds, Better Futures. This is the podcast where we keep it real about mental health and what it actually looks like for teens. I'm Stuti, a sophomore at Valencia High School, and this whole project is part of my Girl Scout Gold Award project. Mental health is something that I see all around me, at school, in my friend group, and in our community, and I know that I'm not the only one. That's why I started Haven Within, to create a space where we can talk openly about the stuff that usually gets ignored. I'm really excited to have Dr. Katie Moore back with us today. She's a licensed psychologist who works a lot with LGBTQIA+ and neurodivergent teens. She does testing for autism and ADHD, runs her own practice where she also trains future therapists, and even helps out at a nonprofit that makes therapy affordable for people. She's been featured in Forbes, Time Magazine, Women's Health, and other big outlets, so I'm really lucky to have her here. So, autism. People talk about it, but a lot of what you hear is stereotypes. The truth is, autism looks different for everyone. Some teens might need more support, while others shine in ways that people don't always recognize. It's a spectrum, and every autistic person's experience is unique. In this episode, we're breaking down autism awareness, what autism is really like, what it's like for teens, and how we can be more supportive and inclusive in everyday life. Dr. Moore, thank you so much for coming back. It's awesome to have you here for the conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me back. It's good to be here.
So how do you define autism from a clinical perspective, and how does that differ from common public perception?
Yeah, so we have our diagnostic manual, right? And so we define it through that, but not only through that. So autism is sensory differences. So maybe having differences in, a variety of our senses, and sometimes some social differences as well. It doesn't have to be all of the things, right? And so sometimes public perception is people with autism aren't ever going to get married, or aren't going to have romantic relationships, or they don't have any friends. That's not necessarily true. It may be that certain social situations become really overwhelming, but they could also still really love being social, right? So it's not that people with autism are just like, hanging out at home and don't like to have friends. Mm-hmm. That's not true at all. Right. And it's not that they're just not interested in dating. That's also not true. For some people that might be true, just like for some people without autism that might be true, right? But I think that's one of the public kind of ideas of autism that just isn't true. The other thing is that people are going to have difficulty with all their sensory, all of their senses, and that's not true either. People may have difficulty with some and not with others. And then there's some older kind of thoughts about autism that are from before we had our most recent DSM, or Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. That's our diagnostic manual. Mm-hmm. So our most recent one came out just a few years ago. The one before that was the major revision, which came out in 2013. Prior to 2013, autism looked a lot different. And so sometimes people are still holding on to like older stuff. Sometimes people think there's always an intellectual disability alongside autism, and that's also not true. Mm-hmm. So there's lots of misconceptions in the public. Also how autism is developed. Total misconception in the public for some people. So it's important to get the facts and know what's real and what's just a rumor.
Right. So what are some of the most persistent myths about autism that you encounter in your work, or that you've heard around you?
I don't encounter this one so much in my work, but I hear about it a lot. And that is that autism is caused by vaccines. So there was a study done a long, long time ago where there was a man who came to the conclusion that autism was caused by a certain vaccine. He later kind of recanted that and said, yeah, my study was faulty. That actually wasn't true. Some of the data was just false in that study. There is actually no link at all between autism and vaccines. And so sometimes people are still kind of holding on to that old, like I say research, but it wasn't factually based research, right? But sometimes people are still holding on to that old stuff. And I do hear that kind of out and about in the public sometimes, or that diet can impact whether you have autism or not, that eating certain foods can make you autistic, or eating certain foods when you're really little can change your brain and make you autistic. That's not true either. And that's kind of a thing that's kind of running rampant right now as a rumor. It's just, we don't have any science that's telling us that at this point. If the science changes, then our understanding of that might change. But right now, we have no science that's telling us that. And then as far as things that I hear clinically in my practice, it's usually people's parents who are misunderstanding autism. So I will sometimes have young adults who come in and are tested for autism, and their parents don't believe the diagnosis or challenge the diagnosis because they say things like, but you're really smart, you can't have autism. And being smart and having autism are not, they're not connected or disconnected.
Right.
They're just totally separate things, right? So that's one thing that I hear quite a lot, which is really unfortunate, because it really tells me where the stigma is there, that people believe that people with autism are not intelligent, and that's just not the case. It used to be a long time ago that if you had ADHD, you could not also be diagnosed with autism. And now we know that they're highly co-occurring.
Right.
Many people who have one also have the other. But at one point, that is what we kind of knew as our diagnostic criteria. It was long before I was a clinician, but that was at one point true. Some people still use an old diagnosis, which is Asperger's disorder, to describe people who have low support needs, who are autistic. So low support needs means you don't have a high level of need for people to kind of come and give you extra supports to kind of get through your day or get through the things you need to accomplish. So for people who had low support needs, it used to be that they would be diagnosed with something called Asperger's disorder. We now know that autism is more of a spectrum. It didn't used to be a spectrum. It used to be, this is it, right? So now we know that it's more of a spectrum, and what used to be Asperger's disorder is kind of now lumped into that, and we don't use the term Asperger's anymore for a variety of reasons. One, because autism is a spectrum, and so it's better explained just by that. There's also some negative history around the person who that disorder was named after, and so there's a couple of reasons why we don't really use it anymore. But sometimes people still come in and they say, well, no, I don't have autism, I just have Asperger's disorder. And that may have been how they were diagnosed if they were diagnosed a long time ago. But now it's just not a diagnosis anymore, so it would be rolled over into the new one.
So how has the understanding of autism evolved over the past decade in clinical practice?
So in the last decade, it hasn't evolved much as far as testing, although there has been some changes in that. You know, we have updated versions of tests, that kind of thing. That kind of stuff happens all the time. But as far as treatment, things have changed a lot. So we've gone from a model where we're asking for compliance-based therapy. So we're asking, not now, but we used to ask autistic folks to kind of essentially learn how to mask in order to exist in society. So learn how to do things the way that a neurotypical person would do things, and then just fake it till you make it. That used to be the way that therapy worked, and that's not really ideal, right? That really creates a lot of stress on the person who now has to like pretend to be somebody else all day, right? And then I get home and I burn out and I like have a meltdown, and that's not great, right? Because I've been carrying all this stress all day of having to pretend, right? So we don't do that anymore, at least in neurodivergent affirming therapy. There are some therapies that still practice that way. Somebody who calls themselves a neurodivergent affirming therapist typically wouldn't, but you can ask questions. You know, if people who are listening are thinking about going to a therapist, certainly ask questions about this. Now we've gone to a model that is more, how do we help you cope with the things that just are true about the world and get through your day in a way that feels safest for you? And so that might mean we're gonna get loops. So loops are little kind of noise canceling headphones.
Oh, yes, I've heard of those.
Yeah, you can kind of switch to different settings to have more or less noise kind of let in. So it might be that, right? So instead of saying, just use your coping skills to get through the really noisy environment you have to go through, which, you know, you can also use coping skills if you additionally need that. But also we could just get you some loops, and then that would help you exist in that environment that maybe you have to be in, right? Also, maybe you don't have to be in a really noisy environment. If you don't have to be in a noisy environment, how can we get an environment that's not as noisy, right? So how can we get you to a place where you don't have to deal with that? So those would be like neurodivergent affirming strategies, is instead of saying, well, you know, just ground yourself and count to 5 and do all these things while you're in the middle of Disneyland because Disneyland is busy and overwhelming. Instead of saying that, we can say, okay, how can we get you, you know, you want to go to Disney and it sounds really fun and you're really looking forward to it. So I'm all for you going to Disney. How can we come up with strategies to get you through the day that is not just power through it? Right? Can we get you some headphones? Are there places to take breaks that are quiet? Do they have maybe nurses stations that you can go in and sit down for a while? Are there restaurants that tend to be quieter than other places? Are there places where there's just less sensory? So maybe there's still noise, but there's not a bunch of bright lights there, and so it's not overwhelming in that way, right? So these would be strategies that we would use with somebody when we call it neurodivergent affirming care. Is we're not saying just comply and figure it out and power through it. We're saying, how do we find ways for you to do the things you want to do and do it in a way that feels good for you? When we're in school, that might look like you can take tests in a classroom by yourself because taking tests with everybody else taking tests is too much. Or might be you can listen to music while you take a test because hearing the tick of the clock is too much, right? So it can also look like changing the environment for the autistic person.
How do you usually tailor therapy to accommodate different sensory, communication, or cognitive needs?
Yeah, so I have some things around the office that I'll get up in a second and kind of show you. But essentially, every person who comes in is going to have different needs, right? So I have multiple things around the office that can help with that. So one of the things, I have some scented lotion over here that is like a mint and eucalyptus. So sometimes that can really help for people. Yes, I am in the camera. Sometimes the lotion can really help for people who maybe need to smell something to feel calm. We also have candles that people can choose to light or not light, so that can be really helpful. We typically would have our overhead lights off during therapy and have just this light and the window light in so that it's not so much sensory with the bright lights. Here we're filming, so we have them on, but typically we'd have them off. We also have some fidgets, so this is one of my favorite fidgets. You can kind of put it on your, and then it just can kind of flow. So this is a really fun one that a lot of people will use, and they can just do this while they're talking to me, and that's fine. It's not distracting for me. I'm very used to it, so if this is something that helps somebody feel comfortable, then they can do this. A lot of people will play with this pillow here during therapy. We have some soft stuffies, we have some stress balls, we have other sensory toys that you can kind of play with and stretch. We also have these games over here, and we have got a few of them. I'm going to grab one of them. Okay. So these are games that are specifically made for therapists, and for somebody who maybe is autistic and has a hard time knowing what to say to me, especially in the beginning stages of us getting to know each other, we can play games. And these games can help us get to know each other. So this one in particular, it's called Uno. It's like Uno. And so it's just questions that we can ask each other, and it plays just like Uno plays, right? And at the end, you would say Uno instead of Uno. And then you have to kind of say something that you've learned about each other when somebody's about to win the game. And so it's just little questions that are not high stress type questions. It's not super invasive or asking you about your personal life. Like this one is, would you rather be stuck in a warm, dark place or be stuck in a freezing, sunny place? Right? And so very low stress questions, but we can build on that then, right? Because maybe you say, well, I'd like to be in a freezing sunny place. And I would go, really, why? And you might say, well, because, I grew up where it snows and I'm used to the cold. And so I could always put a jacket on. Okay, well, now I know you grew up where it snows. And now we have a way to start the conversation, right? So what might have felt really overwhelming to know, like, how do I start this conversation? Now is a little bit easier because now I know, okay, you grew up here. This is an introduction into talking about how you grew up, and we can build on that. Or if that doesn't feel comfortable, we can keep playing the game and it's no big deal, and just keep getting to know each other for a little while longer. So we have lots of things around the office. We also have books and stuff that we can look at together, especially for younger kids. We can read through books together. And we try to make it so that there's something for kind of whatever your sensory needs are at that time.
Okay, so, perfect.
Yeah.
Actually, the game sounds really fun.
Yeah, it can be nice.
How do you usually involve families or caregivers in supporting autistic clients?
Yeah, so I guess it depends on the age, right? So if we're talking about like a young kid, then it might be a lot of, bringing the parents in for a few minutes at the beginning or at the end of session to give them education. Not to necessarily tell them what their kid told me in session, because that should stay private between the therapist and the kiddo, but definitely to tell them on, things that might be helpful to implement at home. So, hey, it might be helpful to implement this kind of schedule at home, or hey, it might be helpful to try these new foods at home. We talked about trying new foods, right? Or it might be helpful to have an earlier bedtime or a later bedtime, right? So if it's a younger kid, probably I'm gonna pull the parents in for maybe the first 10 minutes or the last 10 minutes, and usually with the kid's consent. And I would always talk with the kid first about like, okay, this is what I'm thinking about talking to your parents about. Does that feel good for you? And that way we have time to kind of tweak it and change it in a way that feels right for the kiddo. If it's a teenager, I'm probably gonna talk to the parents a little bit less, because teenagers have a lot more stuff that is a lot more private that they might be a little bit more fearful of me talking to parents about. But I will still always tell parents how a kid is doing. I will not tell them what the kid is saying, but I will tell them how they're doing. So, hey, your kid is doing really well. They probably don't need to come every week anymore. Let's switch to every other week, right? Or, things are really hard right now, and maybe, a tutor might be really helpful at this time, right? So things like that, I'll check in with the parents, but I may not tell them as much of what we're doing in session, because teenagers really need to feel like they have that confidential, safe place, right? There's a lot of life changes going on in your teenage years. Sometimes we will have people who are in their 20s who are autistic, and their parents will bring them to therapy, and the parents want to be heavily involved in therapy. If that's the case, sometimes we would spend some time with the parent trying to help them see their child as an adult, because their child is an adult now. And again, this is all going to be dependent on the individual support needs, right? Somebody who has really high support needs, we're going to involve the parents a lot more. But assuming this person has lower support needs, it may be a matter of helping to educate the parent that, hey, your kid is an adult now, and they actually can do a lot of this stuff, right? Like they can get a job, they want to work, and they are capable of doing that. So let me help you to kind of learn about these things that they're able to do more independently now. So it kind of depends on the specific situation, the age, the support needs, and then we just do what we can to make sure that the client is getting everything that they need and is getting the supports they need. Any communication we have with anybody other than the client would be with the client's consent.
What are some challenges that autistic individuals face that many people may not even realize?
I think some of the social and sensory overload, especially if they have been taught to mask or if they're later diagnosed. So you or your listeners may or may not know this, girls are diagnosed much less frequently than boys are, and typically later than boys are. So this is obviously not a blanket statement. It's not true for everybody, but generally, statistically, this is kind of what we see. Some of that we think is because the way that we socialize girls, at least in this country, is a little bit people pleasing already, right?
Yeah.
And I wish that weren't true, but that is just kind of what it is right now. And so if you've kind of already been taught to like just be good, just be cute and be pretty and be a nice little girl, that's kind of teaching you how to mask already, right? And so we tend to be good at keeping those symptoms to ourselves a little bit longer, and then they don't get caught, right? Some of the testing that we use, some of it catches girls really well, and some of it is known to not catch girls very well. So even some girls who get tested, sometimes it doesn't flag them for it, depending on what tests the clinician uses, which is truly what's informed which tests we do at this practice for that reason. But because we're kind of taught to mask young, sometimes people won't realize that, particularly with young women, the kind of social overload that they sometimes carry, the sensory overload that they sometimes carry. This also happens with boys. It just sometimes will happen more often with girls. And obviously with non-binary folks as well, this is going to happen just the same as it would with anybody else. Right. And I think sometimes people realize like, oh, you seem really outgoing, so you must be outgoing, right? Like you must be an extrovert because you seem really outgoing.
Right.
And that's not always the case, because we can power through a lot of things for a short amount of time, right? So when that person gets home from this really big event where they were talking to people for a few hours and they seemed really energetic and fun and ready to be there, and they maybe really truly enjoyed it, but maybe they get home and they're like, I can't talk to anybody for 2 days now. Like I can't, the rest of my weekend has to be free because I don't have any social battery left, and it's going to take a while to replenish, right? So I think sometimes those are things that people miss, is like, well, you seem fine, so you must be fine. And that's not necessarily true, right? Like I could have a scraped knee right now and I would seem fine to you because I'm wearing jeans and you can't see it. That doesn't mean I am fine, right? So not everything is just what we can see. And I think that's the part that the general public sometimes struggles with, is just understanding that just because somebody can get through it doesn't mean that they're okay, right? Or that it feels okay for them.
Yeah, and I think that applies to just life in general, because a lot of people just make assumptions about people. But yeah, it's really important to not just think that what you see is what you should believe.
Absolutely.
So how do you usually address societal biases or stigma that affect your clients?
Well, I help the client build up themselves, right? So really helping the client to notice it as a bias or a stigma. If I'm the client in this situation and I have been told my whole life that this is just the truth, I'm going to believe that that's just the truth, right? So helping clients to kind of dissect those negative things that they've been told that aren't necessarily true, right? Helping people to kind of recognize, is that something that somebody just told you because they didn't understand, right? Or is that something that somebody told you because they have their own negative bias? And trying to help them to kind of understand, where did those stories go wrong that I've been told, right? And take them apart and then put them back together in a way that makes sense, and is based in reality, right? And is based in, this is what we actually know about autism. It's not really this thing you've been taught this whole time, right? So it's not a quick process. It's not something that they're gonna come in one day and be like, oh, everything was a lie, I'm fine now, right? It truly is a deconstruction and then reconstruction of something new and healthier.
How can workplace, schools, and communities better support autistic individuals, in your opinion?
Have knowledge about it, first of all. Understand some of the biases, and understand that, again, just because somebody can make it through it doesn't mean that they are putting the same effort in as everybody else, right? Like maybe I can make it through something, but I had to put in 4 times the effort as the person next to me. That's not fair, because now I'm like burnt out for the rest of the day, right?
Yeah.
So understanding that just because somebody can make it through and can push through something doesn't mean that that's healthy for them. And offering whatever supports you have and being open to hearing what supports they need in addition to what you've offered.
Okay. What advice would you give to other therapists or professionals working with autistic clients?
I think know your scope of practice, right? So that's a big ethical thing with therapists is our scope of practice. When we're not licensed yet, we get to work within our scope and our supervisor's scope. So we get to work within all the things that we are already really competent in doing, which when we're like baby therapist is usually like anxiety and depression, right? And then we go and we work for a supervisor and we learn from them and we get to work within our own scope and also within our supervisor's scope because they're teaching us, right? And so when we have a supervisor, we're like constantly going to the supervisor like at least once a week, a lot of times multiple times a week, to talk about all of our cases and go through and make sure that we're doing things right and learning new things, and right, so we can work within our scope or our supervisor's scope. Once we're licensed and we're not under supervision anymore, we have to go get training in order to increase our scope of practice. So I would say for clinicians, know your scope of practice, and if neurodivergent affirming care is not in it and you want to do that, there's such a need. And I would highly encourage people to go get training so that they're not unintentionally causing harm. I don't think any therapist out there, I mean, maybe somebody is, there's always a bad player in every field, right? But generally, I don't think therapists are trying to harm people or trying to do the wrong thing. And I think generally clinicians really want to do the right thing and want to help. So it's just a matter of getting the training to be able to help people in a way that is actually going to do good for them.
How can listeners who are friends, family, or colleagues provide any meaningful support to autistic individuals?
You have to find out what support they need first. It's a spectrum, so what one person needs is not the same as what another person needs, and understanding what your individual person needs can be really helpful, right? So I have a person who's really close to me in my life who has autism, and when we're somewhere together, they love to socialize, but it's a time limited thing, right? And so if we're gonna go somewhere, we can kind of have a signal between the two of us of like, okay, it's time, like we need to wrap this up, right? And so I'm super extroverted. I will stay somewhere all day long and talk to people, and I will not be out of energy. I'll have more energy when I left, right? So we're kind of, me and this person, we're kind of the opposite in this way. But having a signal between us where, you know, this person in my life can say like, hey, I'm done, like this is too much for me now, and me being willing to go, okay, like we can go, or okay, we can figure something out where I can continue something that is feeding my soul and I can make sure that you still feel okay, right? So maybe that person leaves and I stay, or maybe we both leave, or maybe we leave and we go to a quiet place for a while and then we go back if we can't, right? So, but we figure out before we go to these events, like what is it that would be the best plan based on what we're doing. So I think having those kinds of conversations with people and just being open to whatever it is they say, and then also if you have needs that are different than those, trying to figure out how do we compromise to meet both of our needs. Right?
Perfect. And the last thing I want to ask you is, how do you think society can improve autism awareness beyond just awareness months or campaigns?
So beyond awareness months and campaigns, because I think those are also great, but I agree, it's not like enough and it's a little bit performative sometimes, right? Exactly. So beyond that, talking about it outside of those months, first of all, making friends with people who are autistic, right? So that you can understand better from like a actual, I'm seeing this in action experience. And also simultaneously learning more about it, right? So maybe you listen to TED Talks on it, or maybe you find somebody who you can kind of check their credentials and make sure they know what they're talking about, right? And learn about it through them. Maybe if you're in therapy, you ask your own therapist if they know about this and if they're specialized in this, right? But learning about it kind of while you're also kind of having people in your life who are autistic. I think having those things at the same time is good, because we don't want to just have people in our life who are autistic and then be like, yeah, I don't need to learn anything because I have an autistic friend. Like, that's
Yeah.
not helpful, right?
Mhm.
And also, you might unintentionally be doing things to harm your friend because you don't know, right?
Mhm.
So I think having both of those processes, but making sure you're getting your information from like valid sources, reliable sources, places that, you know, it's not just a random person on the internet talking to you about it. It's somebody who does this work, somebody who understands, maybe somebody who has a lived experience and is telling you just about their experience, right? One thing that I think is hard is when we have somebody who's talking about their lived experience and it's not the person talking's fault that this happens, but sometimes the person listening goes, oh, so that's how it is for everybody,
Mhm.
right? And that's the person talking didn't do anything wrong. They're just talking about their lived experience. But the person receiving that information sometimes turns off all other experiences and goes, well, if it's not that, then it's not autism. Or all autism looks like that. And that's just not the case. So we want to make sure that we're getting a variety of experiences, understanding from a variety of places, and understanding from people who have the lived experience or have the formal training on it.
Well, thank you so much for raising awareness about autism with me and for helping me debunk all these stereotypes.
Absolutely.